Hey there, welcome back for another ASMR video. Today we're going to be talking about a magical and wonderful place called the Everglades. The Everglades is a national park in Florida in the United States. It was founded on December 6th, 1947, but it has a much more complicated history than just that. It's about the size of about 1.5 million acres, so it is an immense landscape. The Everglades is basically a tropical wetland that is mostly in the southern portion of Florida, so it's really an ecosystem that is not found in any other place on Earth. The Everglades is home to one of the largest wetlands in the world. There's basically 9 distinct habitats that have been found in the park, which include pine rocklands, coastal lowlands, and marine waters. It's a place that's exploding with plants and animals not found anywhere else on the planet. In fact, the Everglades contains the largest growth of protected mangroves in the Western Hemisphere. 1 out of every 3 Floridians, which is about 21 million people, rely on the Everglades for their water supply as well. So it's not just a place that's, for nature. It's a place that is a lifeblood for the south of Florida. The Everglades actually isn't just really in the south, but it begins near Orlando, and it moves, essentially it's like discharged from Lake Okeechobee, which we'll describe in more detail. But it creates a vast and shallow river and creates this slow-moving river which essentially moves through the limestone, the limestone shelf, which is found underneath the ground in Florida. And that's sort of how it gets its name, the River of Grass. So, the Everglades is the 3rd largest national park in the lower U.S. states after Yellowstone and Death Valley. So let's talk a bit more about the ancient geological forces that created this amazing environment. With the rise of sea levels that occurred about 17,000 years ago, that runoff of that water created the vast and shallow lake known as Lake Okeechobee. That runoff eventually slowed, and because again it flowed down to the Florida Bay. But that essentially slowed and created a marshland, which we now know as the Everglades. And that slower runoff, in fact, created an accumulation of about 18 feet of peat in the area as well. So with the rise of those sea levels, the water which once flowed freely over the lowlands, that essentially created a slow-moving sheet of water which actually covered about 11,000 square miles. And that sort of creates this mosaic of ponds, sloughs, sawgrass marshes, hardwood hammocks, and forested uplands. thousands of years, this intricate system evolved and is really just an absolutely fantastic, finely balanced ecosystem. So, like I said, it's really that biological infrastructure for Florida in general, and especially in South Florida. That said, you can imagine it would be a place that would be ripe for development, of course, which is the unfortunate part. So, there was a lot of development in the area, which again, we're going to get more in detail on some of these things, but essentially they tried to develop the land, and this caused problems with the water supply and just the natural ecosystem of Florida, and a lot of the Everglades was developed into towns and cities, actually, and so there's still this battle, but because it was, conservationists and advocates fought for it, it was turned into a national park. So, really, the story of the Everglades is deeply woven with its endless marshes, dense mangroves, towering palms, alligator holes, and tropical fauna. Many different types of people, explorers, native people, Native Americans. They explored this watery landscape and made it their home, and of course, with any valuable resource, there's a story of exploitation there as well. But as I said before, the human habitation in the southern portion of the Florida Peninsula dates to 15,000 years ago. So this is before European colonization. The region was dominated by the native Calusa and Tequesta tribes. And I've actually posted some photos and videos of those ruins, I guess you could call them, or hills, in particular instances on my Patreon and on social media as well. I like to visit them throughout Miami. There was about 4,000 to 7,000 Calusa at their peak. The Tequesta were a bit smaller, but they originally came to Florida following large game that included giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, and spectacled bears. They found an arid landscape that supported plants and animals adapted for desert conditions. However, as I mentioned, about 6,500 years ago, the extreme climate changes brought the wetter landscape that we might know today. So, large animals actually became extinct in Florida at that time, and the people who lived here adapted. So then, when things became wetter again, that was about 3000 BC. Really, the water tables rose quite a bit. That increased the population and the cultural activity here. And that's when the Calusa and the Tequesta really emerged, as I said. And like I said, the Calusa was larger. They were actually the most powerful nation in South Florida. And they controlled about 50 villages located on Florida's west coast. So that's around Lake Okeechobee, on the Florida Keys as well. Most Calusa villages were located at the mouths of rivers or on key islands. They also used canoes for transportation, and South Florida tribes often canoed through the Everglades, in fact. But at that time, they rarely lived there. They took their canoes actually to Cuba as well. So they took trips across the ocean and into the rivers and estuaries. As far as the written record of European exploration, the first record of the Everglades was on Spanish maps, so that was made by cartographers who hadn't actually explored the land. They named the unknown area Laguna del Espiritu Santo, which means Lake of the Holy Spirit. The area was featured on maps for many years without actually having been explored. And of course, if you've been to the Everglades, you can see why that would be. Even with today's technology, it's quite an experience, or quite an adventure. So, the name Everglades itself actually first appeared on a map in 1823, although it was spelled Ever Space Glades as late as 1851. The name Everglades first appeared on a map in 1823, although it was spelled as Everglades as late as 1851. The Seminole tribe, which was the tribe that came after the Calusa and the Tequesta, or really kind of emerged from those two, they called it Pahogi, which means grassy water. The region was actually labeled as Pahogi on a U.S. military map in 1839, but as I mentioned, it had earlier been called the Everglades. So that was through the Seminole Wars, the Second Seminole Wars specifically, but in a future video we can talk a lot more about those wars and their significance to the history of Florida. But for now, just know that the Seminole War tribe that emerged from those other two, and there was a lot of battles between the Spanish and the U.S. and this tribe, and they're a native local American culture from Florida, so they also did live in the Everglades at a time. So in 1817, Spain actually owned Florida. I probably will talk more about this in depth in another video, but in that same year, Andrew Jackson, the president of the U.S., invaded Florida to annex the state to the United States, which was actually the first Seminole War. So Florida became U.S. territory in 1821. Conflicts between settlers and the Seminole tribes increased, and again, like I said, there was another conflict in 1855, which was the Third Seminole War. But like I said, we're not going to delve too much into those, but just know that a few Seminole, 100 Seminole fought off U.S. forces, and that was actually from the swamps of the Everglades. So, kind of in continuing with the story of the Everglades, the U.S. finally essentially leaves them alone, and because they couldn't dislodge them, and so they inhabited that area. So by 1913, the Seminole in the Everglades numbered no more than 325. They made a living by hunting and trading with settlers and raised domesticated animals. The Seminole made their villages in hardwood hammocks and pinelands, which we're going to discuss a little bit later on. And their villages were not large due to the limited size of the hammocks, but essentially till about 1930, the people lived in relative isolation from the majority of the culture that was developing on the other side, like in Miami and things like that. So Florida became a state in 1845. The military made expeditions into the Everglades. In 1840, that was the first public account that the people could read about what the Everglades was like. And in the 1890s, there was further exploration and mapping of the area. Also during this time, though, there was a national push for expansion and progress in the United States, which really occurred in the later part of the 19th century. And this stimulated interest in draining the Everglades for agricultural use. So, really, during this transitional period, wetland removal was not something that was questioned. It was just the proper thing to do in the name of civilization, as they say. Draining the Everglades was suggested as early as 1837, but a resolution in Congress was passed in 1842 to really do like a prospecting or a survey of the possibility of drainage. After the Civil War, a state agency whose purpose was kind of to improve the infrastructure of Florida's roads and canals, etc., and rail lines. So they started to see if perhaps they could make some money on the side. So they met a real estate developer whose name was Hamilton Disston. And essentially he had plans to drain the land for agriculture. He purchased it actually for $1 million in 1881, and he began to construct canals. And at first it seemed to work, lowering the river level, the water levels in the wetlands surrounding the rivers. They actually were effective in lowering the groundwater, but it became apparent that their capacity was insufficient for the wet season. Although the canals did not drain that well, his purchase actually primed the economy of Florida. So when you can imagine today's world, Elon Musk's moves to Texas or something, and people is a big news, and in the same way, he really, his moving and buying this property made big news and attracted tourists and other land buyers. Within 4 years, property values skyrocketed and the population increased significantly. Another well-known industrialist at the time, Henry Flagler, who's also a pretty big name in the city of Miami and Florida, they began to purchase land and building rail lines along the east coast of Florida. And that went as far south as Palm Beach, even in 1893. So, along the way, he built resort hotels and transformed these territorial outposts to tourist destinations. The land bordering the rail lines was then developed as citrus farms, and actually by 1896, the rail line had been extended to Biscayne Bay. Basically 3 months after the first train had arrived, the residents of Miami voted to incorporate the town, and Miami became a prime destination for very wealthy people, and especially after the development of the Royal Palm Hotel, which was one of the first luxury hotels here. So with the construction of canals and newly reclaimed Everglades land, it was promoted actually throughout the United States. It was really the first housing or land boom in Florida. So land developers sold many lots in the first few months of 1912. With the construction of canals, the newly reclaimed Everglades land was promoted throughout the United States. Land developers sold 20,000 lots in just a few months in 1912. Advertisements promised within 8 weeks of arrival, a farmer could be making a living. Although, of course, it took at least 2 months to clear the land. The increasing population in towns near the Everglades hunted in the area. Raccoons and otters were the most widely hunted for their skins. Rum runners used the Everglades actually as a hiding spot during Prohibition. It was so vast there were never enough law enforcement officers to patrol it. The arrival of the railroad, as I mentioned previously, and the discovery that adding trace elements such as copper, which was the remedy for crops sprouting and dying quickly, soon created a population boom. Sugarcane became the primary crop grown in South Florida. Actually, Miami, like I said, experienced another real estate boom. That was the second one. And in 1925, Miami newspapers published editions that were almost all real estate advertising. Waterfront property was, of course, the most highly valued as it is today. Mangrove trees were cut down and replaced with palm trees to improve the view, and a lot of the slash pine, which we'll talk about also later, was cleared. Some of the pine was for lumber, but most of the pine forests were cleared for development. So, as sugarcane production soared and the canals and dikes were all built, the population of these small towns surrounding Lake Okeechobee and really all over the Miami greater metro area, especially post-World War I, really exploded. So, really, about 50% of the original Everglades was developed as agricultural or urban areas, so it's been mostly developed on. So, following that period of rapid development, that's when it really became a world, like a UNESCO designated area. So it's an area that's of global importance and absolutely a place we need to continue to protect. But let's talk about some of the geology and the actual land and animals that live in this beautiful place. So South Florida is a warm and subtropical climate and very well suited for large marshland ecosystems. Layers of porous and permeable limestone affect the climate, weather, and the hydrology of South Florida. Fluctuating sea levels compressed many, many layers of calcium carbonate to sand and shells. The result was the limestone formations that are underneath a lot of the southern portion of Florida. So these compressed sections there's about 5 different ones and they have different compositions. For example, the Tamiami Formation, Tamiami, is a light-colored sands and pockets of quartz about 150 feet thick underneath the southern portion of the Everglades. One of these sections, the Tamiami Formation, I might mispronounce that, which is a compression of highly permeable light-colored sands and pockets of quartz that are actually up to 100 feet thick underneath the southern portion of the Everglades. The flooding of the Everglades is fed by the many rivers in central Florida. Many of these rivers empty directly into Lake Okeechobee, which, like I said, is a vast and shallow lake. The area from Orlando to the tip of Florida, Florida Peninsula, was at one point a single drainage unit, so when rainfall exceeded the capacity of Lake Okeechobee and the Kissimmee River floodplain, it would spill over and flow into the Florida Bay. So, before that urban and agricultural development, the Everglades began actually at the southern edge of Lake Okeechobee and flowed about 100 miles into the Gulf of Mexico. Now this moving river is extremely wide. So this might be very different from other rivers. This is a river that is about 60 miles wide that travels about half a mile a day. So this slow movement of a broad, shallow river is really what gives the Everglades its nickname, which is River of Grass, as I said before. Water leaving Lake Okeechobee can take months or actually years to reach its destination, which is actually in the Florida Bay. That flow of water is essential to the ecosystem in Florida, and especially in the Everglades. The winter dry season is the best time for wildlife viewing in the park. Weather conditions are generally pleasant during the winter, and standing water levels are low, causing the wildlife to congregate central locations. The West Indian manatee is perhaps the animal that is most symbolic of the Everglades National Park. These gentle giants, sometimes called sea cows, spend hours each day grazing on marine grasses and other aquatic plants. The Everglades is also host to 300 species of both fresh and saltwater fish. So, while the Everglades is mostly famous for the alligators, it is also the only place in the world where both alligators and crocodiles coexist. The American alligators that live here are living in the freshwater marshes of the park and sometimes will venture into the Florida Bay. There are over a dozen species of turtle that are also known to live in the Everglades, which also include tortoises and terrapins. Some of these include loggerhead, Atlantic hawksbill, Florida snapping turtles, Atlantic leatherbacks, and the peninsula cooter, Florida red belly, and Florida box turtle. The Everglades also has more than 40 mammal species within the park. One of these is the Florida panther. It's actually a very rare and critically endangered species found in the Everglades. And it's a subspecies of mountain lion that can reach up to actually 6 feet in length. And it's usually found in the pineland habitats of the park. Next, we have the black bear. So, although the American black bear is quite common throughout the continent, the black bears in the Everglades are quite elusive, and it's a rare sight. But they do live there. There's also the bottlenosed dolphin, which generally can be found in the estuarine and marine habitats of the Everglades. The Everglades National Park is home to more than 360 different species of bird. There are about 3 main groups of birds in the park, which are wading birds. There's about 16 of these different species. Land birds and birds of prey. Wading birds have long legs for wading into water to catch food. The most common wading bird which is found in the Everglades is the white ibis, which is a long, slender bird that uses its curved beak to search through the mud for food such as crayfish. Many land birds are migratory and travel to the year-round warmth of the wetlands during the winter. Many species, such as woodpeckers and owls, can be found in the trees and other dry areas of the park. Birds of prey, such as eagles, hawks, and osprey, can also be found throughout the park as well. There are about 750 native seed-bearing plants in the park, and about 160 plant species which are threatened, endangered, or commercially exploited. Some of the many plant groups in the park include, for example, bromeliads, cacti, and succulents. Over 100 species of native grasses, lichens, and the highest density of wild orchids of any national park in the United States. at least the continental United States. There's marine plants and algae, seagrasses, and hundreds of species of native wildflowers. So now let us talk about some of the different ecosystems that exist in the Everglades. There are many different types, and the boundaries between them are so and absent. The primary feature of the Everglades is the Sawgrass Marsh. The sawgrass thrives in the slow-moving water, but does need some oxygen to reach its roots, and it's at risk when there's a lot of flooding. Where sawgrass grows densely, few animals or other plants live, except for one, of course, which is the alligator, which often will choose these areas for nesting. Sloughs are free-flowing channels of water which develop in between the sawgrass prairies. Sloughs are about 3 feet deeper than sawgrass marshes, and they may stay flooded for at least 11 months out of the year, and sometimes multiple years in a row. So we can see an example of a slough in this video I recorded here, but it's filled with aquatic animals such as turtles, alligators, snakes, and fish which thrive there. Also, submerged floating plants grow here, and some of those are the bladderwort, water lily, and spatterdock. Wet prairies are slightly elevated like sawgrass marshes, but with greater plant diversity. The surface is covered in water only 3 to 7 months of the year, and the water is on average shallow at only 4 inches deep. This area supports animals such as crayfish and snails and larval amphibians. These tend to be the region that border between sloughs and sawgrass marshes. Alligators have also created a niche in wet prairies. With their claws and snouts, they dig at low spots and create ponds free of vegetation that remain submerged throughout the dry season. Small islands of trees growing on land raise between 1 and 3 feet above sloughs, and prairies are often called tropical hardwood hammocks. So they may range from 1 to 10 acres in area and appear in freshwater sloughs, sawgrass pines, or pineland. Hammocks are slightly elevated on limestone plateaus, so that's several inches, usually around the surrounding peat. Hardwood hammocks exhibit a mixture of subtropical and hardwood trees such as southern live oak, gumbo limbo, royal palm, the last two of which you'll see a lot of in the forest shown in this video. And they grow in very dense clumps. Near the base of these areas, sharp saw palmettos flourish, so that makes actually the hammocks very difficult for people to penetrate. But it is ideal for small mammals, reptiles, and amphibians who find this type of habitat perfect. Water and slough flows around the islands as well and creates moats. And the moats protect the trees that are in the hammocks. Usually the trees that are in the hammocks are limited to height, or in height by the weather factors such as frost, lightning, and wind, but on the whole, the majority of trees grow no more than 55 feet in these areas. Some of the driest land in the Everglades is Pineland, and that is located in the highest part of the Everglades. Often there's very little water, or it's just a few puddles here and there. It's Some of the driest land in the Everglades is the Pineland ecosystem, which is located in the highest part of the Everglades. Often there is very little water or just a few puddles here and there. The most significant feature of the Pineland is that single species of South Florida slash pine I mentioned. The slash pine was cleared heavily when South Florida was being developed in places like Miami. Pineland communities require fire to maintain them, and the trees have many adaptations that help promote and resist fire. South Florida slash pines are insulated by their bark to protect them from the heat. The sandy floor of the pine forest is covered with dry pine needles that are highly flammable, and so this allows them to survive this threat. Fire will kill the other plants on the forest floor, but it opens pine cones to germinate the seeds. And a period without significant fire can actually turn pineland into a hardwood hammock as the larger trees overtake the smaller pines. So next we have cypress swamps, which it isn't in the area that I filmed this video, but they can be found throughout the Everglades. And the largest area of cypress is found in Collier County. The Big Cypress Swamp is really to the west of the Sawgrass Prairies and Sloughs, and it is known as Big Cypress. That's one of the main areas here. This is another lovely area to hike and explore, and the name refers to its area rather than the height or the diameter of the trees, so it measures about 1,200 square miles. The Big Cypress sits atop a bedrock covered by a layer of limestone, and that also contains quartz, which creates that sandy soil and allows for a variety of other plant species that are different from the rest of the Everglades. So although the Big Cypress is the largest growth of cypress swamps in South Florida, cypress swamps can also be found on the Atlantic coastal ridge, which is near Lake Okeechobee, as well as in sawgrass marshes. Cypresses are very uniquely adapted to thrive in flooded conditions, so you can often find other trees mixed in with them: red maple, swamp bay, and pop ash. As the water from Lake Okeechobee and the Big Cypress makes its way towards the ocean, it meets with salt water and forms brackish water. And that's where you see mangrove trees, which are well adapted to the zone of brackish water where fresh and salt water meet. In the wet season, fresh water pours out into the Florida Bay, and sawgrass begins to grow closer to the coastline. In the dry season, and particularly in extended periods of drought, the salt water creeps inland into the coastal prairie, an ecosystem that buffers the freshwater marshes by absorbing seawater. Mangrove trees begin to grow in freshwater ecosystems when the saltwater goes a bit too far inland. Mangroves grow in oxygen-poor soil. They can survive drastic water level changes and are tolerant of salt, brackish, and fresh water, as I stated before. 3 species of mangrove are integral to coastline protection during severe storms. Mangroves really absorb the energy of waves and storm surges. Everglades mangroves especially serve as a nursery for fish, birds, and other animals. In fact, much of the coast and the inner estuaries are built on mangroves. There are approximately 100 keys in the Florida Bay, and many of them are mangrove forests. The freshwater coming into Florida Bay from the Everglades creates perfect conditions for vast beds of turtle grass and algae formations, which are really great for animals living there. Sea turtles and manatees eat the grass, while clams eat the algae formations and microscopic plankton. Female sea turtles also return to nest on the shore, and manatees will spend their winter months in the warmer waters of the bay. The seagrasses also serve to stabilize the seabeds and protect shorelines from erosion by absorbing the energy of the waves. So there's one other issue that does need to be addressed with regards to the Everglades, and that is, as a center for trade and travel between the U.S., the Caribbean, and South America, Florida, especially South Florida, is vulnerable to invasive species, or species of plants and animals that adapt aggressively to conditions in the Everglades, which allow them to reproduce faster and grow larger than they would naturally in their native environments. Approximately 26% of all species of fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals in South Florida are exotic, more than any other part of the U.S. And the region hosts one of the highest numbers of exotic plant species in the world. Many pets have escaped or been released into the Everglades from the surrounding urban areas. So some of them find the conditions quite favorable and have established self-sustaining populations competing for food and space with native animals. For example, the Burmese python, which is actually native to southern Asia, and it is a relatively new invasive species in the Everglades. This species can grow up to 20 feet long, and they compete with alligators for the top of the food chain. The pythons are believed to be responsible for drastic decreases in the population of some mammals within the park. The invasive species that cause the most damage to bird populations is the cat, both domestic and feral. Cats that are let outside live close to suburban populations and have been estimated to number 640 per square mile. In such close numbers in historic migratory areas, they have devastating effects on migratory bird populations. So there's a lot to think about for future conservation, and we still need to do our best to protect this lovely and wonderful, magical place. That said, I hope you enjoyed the footage of this beautiful scenery, and I hope that you one day get to visit there, or if you have visited there, I hope you had a lovely time, and I hope that you have a good one.